Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Budget 101 webinar. My name is Jason Warner, and I am the Director of Strategic Engagement with Greater Ohio Policy Center. And I'm excited to have you all with us this morning as we will be briefly discussing the process for enacting the state budget here in the state of Ohio. Before we begin, some housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website in the next 24 hours. For the benefit of those of you who may have to leave the presentation early, or for anyone who is unable to make it this morning. Because this session is being recorded, we ask that you please remain muted throughout the presentation and pose any questions that you may have in the chat box. I am being assisted today with the webinar by my colleague, Aaron Clapper, who will be monitoring the chat and forwarding questions to me for the end of session Q&A. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Over the next 6 months, Ohio lawmakers will be asked to pass 4 different budgets, which will provide funding for the next 2 years for a variety of programs, fund state government operations and capital projects, as well as enact a number of laws and policy changes within those documents. A total of 6 budgets are generally enacted by the state during any given 2-year legislative cycle. These budgets are generally the only opportunities to secure program funding during the 2-year legislative cycle. Standalone bills that include programmatic funding are very rare, and the next 6 months are your only real shot at securing funding for any priority projects you will be working towards. These budgets include the transportation budget, which allocates Ohio motor fuel tax and licensing fees for highway infrastructure projects, as well as the State Highway Patrol. The main operating budget, which funds general government operations primarily from state tax and income tax revenues, as well as budgets from the Ohio BWC and Ohio Industrial Commission, which are based on fees paid by businesses that belong to those entities. The capital appropriations and reappropriations budgets will not be enacted until next year. Today's presentation is going to focus on the 2 which are most impact the work that Greater Ohio is involved with, the transportation and main operating budgets. The main operating budget provides funding for most state government agencies, the legislature, and the judiciary. The budget covers 2 state fiscal years. Now, we are currently operating under fiscal year 2023, which actually began on July 1st, 2022, and runs through June 30th. The next budget will cover fiscal years 2024 and 2025. In addition to funding, the budget's documents often include law and policy changes made by the legislature, and in some instances proposed by the governor, which use the budget as a vehicle for making the changes. Because the budget is such an all-encompassing and time-consuming process, this is done for 2 reasons. 1, because it is one of the few pieces of legislation that must pass each year, therefore making it convenient. And 2, because of its sheer size and volume, it is often easy to sneak items in which otherwise might draw considerable notice and oftentimes controversy. Now, this does not always guarantee that those provisions will become law, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. The transportation budget provides funding for the Ohio Department of Transportation, as well as some funding for Ohio's Department of Public Safety and the Ohio State Highway Patrol. Like the main operating budget, the transportation budget often includes a number of law and policy changes related to safety, such as adjusting speed limits, regulating freight weight, or prohibiting texting while driving. One unique feature of the transportation budget is that it cannot be passed as an emergency measure. It requires a 90-day effective date, similar to most legislation passed by the legislature. Therefore, the transportation budget must be passed by March 31st in order for it to become effective at the start of the state fiscal year on July 1st. Briefly, though, we are not talking or taking a closer look at them today, I do want to mention the 2 other budgets lawmakers must enact this year: the Bureau of Workers' Compensation and the Ohio Industrial Commission budgets. These funds allocated in both of the budgets are tied to fees that are paid by Ohio businesses that belong either to the BWC or the IC. These funds go into separate funds managed by the state and therefore require their own independent budgets to have the revenues allocated to run these 2 important state agencies. The process involved is usually very low key and without controversy, but occasionally, such as in the General Assembly that began in 2019, issues do arise and some budgets may miss the statutory enactment deadline. Like the other budgets we have discussed, they both must be enacted by July 1st. However, unlike the transportation budget, they can be passed as emergency measures to negate the need for a 90-day effective period. Finally, the capital budgets, which will not be enacted until next year. These budgets are passed to provide funding for the acquisition, construction, equipment, or renovation of buildings and other facilities of government agencies, except the Department of Transportation, and include projects at the county and local government level funded through state agencies. The reappropriations budget is to reauthorize the use of funds for projects that are underway but have not yet been completed, while the capital budget is for new projects. Now, first and foremost, there are a few important legal requirements that we must discuss as it relates to the state budget. While these primarily impact the main operating budget, the principles apply to all 6 of the budgets that must be approved. First, the budget needs to be balanced. Unlike the federal government or even some state governments, Ohio cannot pass a budget that relies on deficit spending. While there is not a specific provision in the state constitution which says the budget must be balanced, there are several provisions which, when read together, make it clear that a balanced budget is required. Here on the screen, you can see the various provisions in the Ohio Constitution that spell this out. Furthermore, the Ohio Revised Code, section 126.05, requires the governor to curtail spending in the event of insufficient revenues. This is something that Governor DeWine had to do in 2020 to address revenue shortfalls due to the COVID-19 pandemic. When developing the state budget, the Ohio Revised Code further limits the amount appropriations may increase in the aggregate year over year. Ohio limits spending growth with a budget rule based on the previous year's spending, inflation, and population growth. The rule is binding and requires a 2/3 legislative supermajority to override it. Ohio also limits total authorized debt and debt services incurred by the state. Now, it is important to note that the key phrase there is in the aggregate. Individual line items may grow substantially more than the 3.5% limit that is currently in place. However, the total amount of spending in any budget cannot grow more than 3.5%. There are provisions in the law which do allow for circumstances where the General Assembly may exceed the limitation for a fiscal year. First, excess appropriations may be made in response to the governor proclaiming an emergency concerning such things as an act of God, a pandemic, or terrorist attack. The excess amounts may be used only for that emergency. As the chief executive of the state, the governor proposes the budget to the state legislature. The process of developing the state budget begins about 6 months before the budget is presented to the legislature, when the Office of Budget and Management provides guidance to state agencies and requests their funding proposals for the next 2 years. OBM organizes these requests into what is known as the Blue Book, which includes what the proposed funding for the various state agencies is per the line items created by law, and also includes the sources of funding for every appropriation request. The Blue Book is so called because pre-computers, the hard copies were bound with a blue cover. The legislature must be presented to the legislature 4 weeks after the new General Assembly convenes. This year, that is Tuesday, January 31st. It is worth noting that when a new governor takes office, state law provides extra time for the presentation of his or her first budget. In that circumstance, the governor has until March 15th to submit the budget to the legislature. Because Governor DeWine is in his second term, this extended timeline does not apply. In 2019, when he took office after succeeding former Governor John Kasich, he did have the benefit of the extra time to prepare the budget proposal. Now we are going to begin looking at the specific budget processes by starting with the transportation budget. We begin with the transportation budget because legislatively, this is the first of the 4 budgets that will be taken up by lawmakers and the first to be enacted. The transportation budget provides funding for highway operating, capital projects, and other transportation modes. As we have noted, it must be enacted by March 31st to provide for the 90-day effective period and have funding available at the start of the next fiscal year on July 1st. Other provisions, as changes in state law, may have set effective dates that are later than July 1st. For example, if there is a proposal to raise or lower the speed limits on Ohio highways, the legislature could provide for additional time to phase in this new requirement, say until January 1st of 2024, in order to provide ODOT more time to provide and prepare the newly installed signage on the state's roadways. Now, this is an issue that seems to come up every 2 years, but it bears repeating. The Ohio Constitution mandates that Ohio's motor fuel tax can only fund roadway construction and maintenance. It cannot be applied to any other use within the Ohio Department of Transportation. Because the motor fuel tax can only be used on roadway maintenance and construction, beginning in 2019, an appropriation of general revenue funds was made in the transportation budget to fund public transportation. The budget saw a total of $140 million allocated for public transit over the 2-year budget. While this number has been reduced in the most recent state budget, it was substituted with federal motor fuel tax revenue Ohio receives, which does not have the same restrictions state motor fuel tax revenue does. The federal highway funding that Ohio receives is more flexible in its use and has, as currently, been applied for uses within the ODOT budget. Other appropriations within the transportation budget include rail maintenance, airport improvements and maintenance, generally from federal funds, as well as paying debt or repaying bonds that Ohio has taken out to pay for infrastructure projects. Now, in terms of process, most of the hearings are typically conducted by the House Finance Subcommittee on Transportation, while the full Finance Committee will hear preliminary testimony from the Department of Transportation, Department of Public Safety, and the Ohio State Highway Patrol about their specific budget requests. The subcommittee, which consists of 5 members of the Finance Committee, 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats, will hear testimony and do a deeper dive into the specifics of the requests that have been presented by those departments, advocates who propose alternatives to what has been proposed in the as-introduced budget, and testimony from the general public who are interested in the transportation budget. Once these hearings are completed by the subcommittee, the work will return to the full Finance Committee, where the subcommittee will present a report with recommendations of changes that should be made to the proposed budget. Members of the Finance Committee will then have 2 opportunities to present amendments to the budget. First, with the substitute bill, which will represent the first House version of the transportation budget proposal, then as amendments to the substitute bill. Most often, amendments will be made to the sub-bill will come in the form of an omnibus amendment, which is a document which contains all of the amendments that are supported by the majority party in the House. Members of the minority will then offer their own amendments, some of which may be accepted, most of which will be tabled. The bill will then be reported and sent to the full House of Representatives for consideration. Final passage of the House version of the transportation budget should occur by the end of February. The process in the Ohio Senate will be very similar to what we see happening in the House. The difference is that typically the Senate committee that handles the transportation budget is the Transportation Committee, not the Finance Committee. The Senate will also hold preliminary hearings on the transportation budget before the House version of the bill is passed. Once the amendment process is wrapped up, the full Ohio Senate is expected to pass the Senate version of the transportation budget by mid-March. Now, because there will most likely be major differences between the 2 budgets, it will be necessary to send the budget to a conference committee. After the House votes to reject the Senate version of the budget, the Senate will vote to insist on their changes and move to create a committee of conference to work out the differences between the 2 bills. The conference committee will consist of members of both the House and the Senate, with 3 from each chamber, 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat, who will be the formal negotiators. In practice, most of the negotiations do go on behind the scenes and will be between the leadership in the House and the Senate. While the conference committee is supposed to be limited to negotiating the differences between the 2 bills, it is not unheard of for these negotiations to also ultimately include new provisions which were never a part of the budget prior to the conference committee, or significantly altered versions of the proposals that did not at one point appear in the bill. Once negotiations are completed, the conference committee will vote to approve a conference report that then goes to the House and Senate to vote, outlining the final agreement agreed upon versions of the budget. This will occur by March 31st. Now, a conference committee is not necessarily a given. In 2021, members of the House and Senate majority leadership debated differences between the House version and what the Senate was proposing behind closed doors, and the House later simply voted to concur with the Senate version of the bill. This is rare in the budget process, and given the political situation at the State House this year, exceedingly unlikely to happen in 2023. But if I have learned anything working around the State House these past 20 years, it is to never say never. The final version of the budget is then sent to Governor DeWine for his approval. Now, the governor's team will be a part of the budget negotiations throughout the legislative process, including the conference committee. The governor must sign the bill by April 1st for the 90-day effective period to take effect. When the bill arrives at the governor's desk for signature, the governor can exercise his line item veto power. Now, if you do not know what the line item veto is, which is different from the governor's general veto power, briefly, it is the ability for the governor to essentially cross out language in any legislation that includes a budget appropriation, including funding, that he disagrees with. These vetoes must include a detailed reason for why the governor has decided to disallow the item from the final bill. The line item veto can be applied to policy changes or funding and allows the governor to delete certain items from the budget while approving the overall package so that funding may continue for general functions outlined in the budget. The governor does not have the final say over this, however. As with any veto, the legislature can vote to override a governor's line item veto with a 3/5 vote in both chambers. In the House, this requires 60 votes, while in the Senate, this requires 20. Now, while the House is working on the transportation budget primarily in the transportation subcommittee, the rest of the Finance Committee will simultaneously be working on the main operating budget. The main operating budget process, the main budget provides funding for most state agencies, boards, and commissions, the state legislature, and the judiciary. The budget must be enacted by June 30th because, again, the next state fiscal year begins on July 1st. The Ohio Constitution sets out that spending bills like the budget that provide for tax levies and appropriations for current expenses of the state government and state institutions can be passed without the 90-day effective period. Other provisions in the bill, specifically the law and policy changes, take effect either after 90 days or on dates specified in the legislation. The main operating budget contains revenues from multiple sources, including the state sales and use tax, the state income tax, the cigarette tax, public utilities taxes, business taxes, lottery profits, and license and registration fees from state agencies. The sales and use tax and income tax constitutes the largest source of revenue in the budget. In 2023, these made up 55% of all GRF funds. State expenditures in fiscal year 2021 was $22.61 billion. This excludes any federal funds that the state may have received, of which recently there have been substantial due to legislation such as the ARPA. Like the transportation budget, the main operating budget is passed to cover a 2-year period, referred to as a biennium. And again, Ohio is currently operating under fiscal year 2023, with the next budget beginning on July 1 being fiscal year 2024. The main operating budget has increasingly become a tool for the enactment of laws and policy changes not directly related to the budget. Again, we know the reasons for this. But again, like all appropriations bills, however, there are opportunities for them to be subjected to the governor's light item veto power. Like the transportation budget, the main operating budget process begins with preliminary hearings before the House Finance Committee. The initial hearings will include the Office of Budget and Management and the Ohio Legislative Service Commission, providing testimony explaining the finances behind the budget, and answering questions about the process involved in developing the budget proposal. From there, standing subcommittees will take testimony from all state agencies, boards, and commissions, as well as testimony from the general public. The 5 subcommittees from the previous General Assembly were the Agriculture, Development, and Natural Resources Subcommittee, Health and Human Services, Higher Education, Primary and Secondary Education, as well as the previously mentioned Transportation Subcommittee. This year, 2 additional subcommittees have been created, the Infrastructure and the American Rescue Plan, as well as the Public Safety. Similar to the transportation budget process, the subcommittee will hear testimony and then provide reports back to the full Finance Committee, where a substitute bill followed by a majority-produced omnibus amendment and minority-supported standalone amendments will be offered. The committee will send the bill to the full House of Representatives, where it is expected to be voted on in either late April or early May. Over in the Senate, like the transportation budget, preliminary hearings will get underway in late April while the House is wrapping up work on the House version of the budget. The work will then be undertaken by the Senate Finance Committee. During the last General Assembly, the Senate did farm out the work of reviewing proposals and taking testimony from various state agencies, boards, and commissions, along with public testimony, some of the body's regular standing committees, the most notable being the General Government Budget Committee. However, most of this work will still be undertaken by the full Finance Committee. As in the House, the full Finance Committee will prepare a substitute bill, followed by the majority-produced omnibus amendment and the minority-supported standalone amendments will be offered. The committee will then send the bill to the full Senate, where it is expected to be voted on by mid-June. Again, as with the transportation budget, the major differences in the House and Senate passed versions of the bill will necessitate a conference committee to work out differences, which should be completed by late June, sending the bill on to Governor DeWine for his approval, along with his use of the line item powers to exclude provisions he does not want included in the final budget. In 2021, Governor DeWine did use his veto power, excluding 14 provisions from the budget prior to giving his final assent. 4 years earlier, Governor DeWine did not line item out any provisions in the transportation budget, but he did use his power with a number of items in the main operating budget. At neither time has the legislature opted to override any of the budget items. The last time this occurred was during the Kasich administration in 2017. Now, this brings me to the last area which we'll be focusing on today as part of the budget process. What happens if the legislature misses the deadline to enact a budget? Now, not passing the budget by midnight happens all the time. Back in the day, it was not unheard of for lawmakers to put a piece of paper over the clock in the House and Senate chambers and ignore the time in order to complete the work on the budget. But in more extreme circumstances, passage of the budget goes well beyond midnight and takes days or even weeks to resolve the differences. Most recently, disagreements between the House and the Senate in 2019 resulted in the passage of what is called a continuance budget. That year, the legislature approved a 17-day continuation budget that provided funding at the same level as fiscal year 2019's budget, which ran from July 1st to July 17th of 2019. This provided lawmakers more time to work out differences in the budget, while also ensuring that government would continue to operate as usual. In 2019, a new bill was introduced in the Ohio Senate, Senate Bill 171, where it served as the continuance budget for those 17 days until the final budget agreement was passed. 10 years prior, in 2009, a divided state government in the midst of the Great Recession resulted in the need to pass 3 one-week continuance budgets while negotiations between the House, Senate, and then Governor Ted Strickland continued past July 1st. Those budgets provided funding at 70% of the funding from fiscal year 2009, leading to some staff and agencies being closed partially during this period. The reduction in funding was due to significant losses in state revenue resulting from the recession and the need to plug a state budget deficit to ensure a balanced budget. During that session, continuance budgets were amended into other legislation that was already poised to move in either the House or the Senate. I know this because at one time, a piece of legislation that I had been working on as a legislative aide for 3 years quickly passed and was signed into law because it served as the budget for the third week of July 2009. Now, as we are about 96 hours away from the budget actually being introduced, it is hard to predict if we will be seeing a continuance budget this year. No one likes to have to take this route, but as I have said before, we should never say never when it comes to what can and cannot happen at the Ohio State House. So now that with all that out of the way, I know we've covered an awful lot of material, but I want to open up the chat now to any questions that you may have about the state budget process. Please feel free to submit any questions that you have in the chat. I'll go ahead and pause for just a moment while we do that to see if anyone has any questions. So the only thing that I will go ahead and add at this point is, again, we will not be seeing the actual budget introduction until next week. The first indication that we have of what will be a part of the governor's budget is that yesterday he did have a press conference announcing that one of the things that he wants to pursue as part of the budget is a cleanup of the Ohio Administrative Code. These are the policies that are enacted by state agencies which help to enforce laws that have been passed by the state legislature. It's different from the revised code, but the governor has indicated that his desire as part of the budget is to have that particular document cleaned up to help to reduce the size and efficiency of government. So that's one thing that we know is going to be happening. So the first question we have is, where we are today, what are the any forecasts on the process? So there's an awful lot of unknowns that we are going to be going into with this budget process right now. If you have been paying any attention to what's been going on at the State House right now, you are aware of the fact that there are some lingering animosity within the majority caucus over in the Ohio House over the results of the election of the Speaker of the House, which took place at the beginning of the month. What we don't know is how that lingering animosity is going to impact the budget process itself. They have to pass the budget. There's no getting around that. The question is, what will the budget end up looking like if, for instance, it becomes necessary for the Republican leadership in the House to rely on Democrats in the House in order to help to get that budget passed. There are a lot of things I think that we assumed were going to be part of this budget process this year that may end up falling by the wayside because they can't get the votes in order to pass it. I, for one, think that the Republicans will be able to come together, particularly when it comes to issues such as tax cuts, which we know will likely be a priority for the legislature, given the state position that we find ourselves in right now. But being able to say with any degree of certainty right now what that is going to look like when we start to get into the beginning of April, when the process really starts to get underway, when we start to see those substitute versions, is hard to say. I really wish that I could tell you right now that this was going to be a smooth process. If this is going to be a bumpy process, we really just don't know. There's been an awful lot of uncertainty right now, and we're just going to have to sort of play it by ear. Again, if you do have any questions, go ahead and submit those in the chat. I'll go ahead and give you about another minute or so to go ahead and submit those questions. And if not, if you feel like I've done a great job covering everything today, then we'll just go ahead and, sorry about that. Somehow we stopped with the screen share. Give me a minute here and we'll try to get that back up. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, we do have another question here. Any forecast from agencies from the initial OBM ahead of the Blue Book, or have to wait and see in the next 96 hours? So that's a very good question. So we have seen the quote unquote recommendations that were submitted by the state agencies to the Office of Budget and Management as part of the preparation process for preparing the state budget. Most of that, yeah, so the two things that we saw in the recommendations that were submitted to the Office of Budget Management, and I must emphasize that what we don't know is whether or not that is actually going to be what is in the governor's recommendations. This was what was presented by the state agencies to OBM. Final decisions will be made by the governor's office. But among the recommendations that we did see in there, for instance, the Department of Transportation recommended that funding for public transportation be reduced. Current budget right now has that funded at about $37 million per year in general revenue funding. And the Department of Transportation had a recommendation of $10.5 million as part of their Blue Book recommendation. Again, we have to wait and see what will be in the as introduced version of the budget, but that was what was in the OBM recommendation document. The Department of Development, which oversees the Brownfield Revitalization Fund, which is a program that Greater Ohio has long advocated for, had some recommendations in there as it related to drawing down the program. They did not, within the document, have any recommendations about continuance of that program. However, we do anticipate from meetings that we have had both with the legislature and the governor's office that there will be recommendations for funding to continue that program when the budget is introduced. So we're going to be keeping a close eye on that as well. So those are just two examples of things that we looked at when we did see those recommendations come through from the state agencies, and is what we're anticipating prior to the budget being introduced. Okay. With no other questions in the chat, I think we'll just go ahead and wrap things up here this morning. So again, everyone, I want to thank you for taking the time to join with us this morning. I'm going to try one more time. I'm not sure what's going on here with the whole screen share. I'm going to try to do this one more time so you can see. There we go. Okay, so yeah, you should be seeing now contact information for myself here at Greater Ohio. If you had some questions that did not get addressed today, you're just feeling a little shy, or if anything comes up after the fact, please feel free to reach out to me. You can see my phone number there on the screen here in the office at 614-224-0187, as well as my email address. I would also encourage you, if you do not already, to follow both Greater Ohio and myself on Twitter. Our accounts are listed there on the screen, and we are going to be providing continuous updates about the budget process, often in real time, on that website as things do get ramped up at the State House. As a reminder, if you missed anything in the webinar, it will be posted on our website by early next week. And once again, I want to thank you all for joining us today. I hope that you have a great rest of the day and an enjoyable weekend. Thank you very much, everyone.